Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
This podcast is entitled Proposed NRC Regulations for Advanced Nuclear Reactors. It is going to be done with myself, Peter D. Wolf, and the participant is going to be Jeff Merrifield. The program will explain what are advanced nuclear reactors and discuss issues regarding newly proposed regulations. I'm Peter D. Wolf, a lawyer with JD and LLM in environmental law. I'm co-founder and director of nuclearenergytv.com and president of Nuclear Energy Solutions, Inc., which is a consulting firm, and Nuclear, NEWCLEAR, Inc. The other participant is Jeffrey Merrifield. Jeff Merrifield is a former commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's a partner in Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, and Pittman, LLP, and he is chair of the Advanced Working Group for USNIC. USNIC is the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council. He is also going to be the MC for the Advanced Reactor Summit in the spring of 2022, and we will proceed in this way. First of all, I'm going to give you a little background about what advanced reactors are. Jeff will talk more, but basically, these are not the large Generation 3 light water reactors that you're used to seeing. They are called Generation 4, and they employ new technologies. They're smaller, versatile, manufactured, actually in a factory, not built on site, and some of them are mobile. And they can be used in a wide variety of contexts. For example, when the solar was knocked out in Puerto Rico, you could bring in some of the small modular reactors, or they may be applicable for the war zone in Ukraine. They're also can be used in remote locations. For instance, I got an inquiry about a mining site where there's no grid. And of course, they're defense applications. These Generation 4 reactors also address the three former objections that some had to nuclear energy, namely safety, cost, and waste. So first, I'd like to talk about how did we get here. A very brief history of nuclear in the US is that after the Atoms of Peace program by Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s, where he envisioned that nuclear power would be available and it would be so cheap that you wouldn't even have to meter it. There was legislation passed, and basically the Generation 3 nuclear plants were basically built in the 1970s. There were 120 plants built, and 93 are still in operation today. In 1979, there was the 3 Mile Island incident, and since then, no nuclear plant has been conceived or built in the US since 3 Mile Island. Although today there are 2 nuclear plants that are under construction in Georgia called Vogtle. 50 years ago, the US was dominant in nuclear energy. Now China and Russia are. And today nuclear is used in so many more ways that it becomes even a lot more valuable. It's still, of course, needed to have strong defense capabilities, but there are many other uses. They range from the microscopic, such as use in cancer treatment, to a macro situation, such as fuel for space travel. Also, the key use for nuclear energy is to produce electricity. Today, nuclear still provides more than 50% of all non-fossil fuel energy in the US. And nuclear could be even more critical to address climate change in the future. There is now bipartisan support in Congress to build up the U.S. nuclear capacity. And as the U.S. is starting to move towards self-sufficiency, we see many different technologies emerging, and also facilities for producing enriched nuclear fuel. There are agreements that are signed here in the US and abroad for Generation 4 reactors. There's great interest here. Bill Gates, for example, started TerraPower some years ago, and now even Elon Musk is talking about nuclear. As an example, domestically, there is now a facility in Wyoming that is a former coal mine, Berkshire Hathaway coal mine, that is going to have a TerraPower nuclear reactor put in. There are also many agreements overseas, including in Ukraine. To give you a better perspective on what is happening in DC from both the congressional and regulatory perspective, I'd like to bring in Jeff Merrifield now. So Jeff, before we get started, can you please tell us a little bit more about the advanced reactors and the types of advanced reactors under development?
Well, Peter, thank you very much. And it's really a delight to be here today. I would say when we talk about advanced reactors, they fall into different categories. One is the type of coolant and moderator that they use. And as you described earlier, the current fleet of 93 reactors we have currently in the United States uses light water, regular tap water, to provide those capabilities. The reactors that we're talking about in the future use different means. Some of them are light water reactors, and I'll talk about a few of those. Some use high temperature gas as a medium, typically helium. That's used to transport the heat from that reactor into the turbine. Some use molten salt, which contains the uranium as well as serves as a moderator, and some are liquid metal cooled. So a variety of designs, technologies that really came out of the U.S. Department of Energy, actually its predecessor, the Atomic Energy Commission, in the 1950s and 1960s. And while they're not new, those technologies were not brought forward because principally the U.S. Navy wanted to have a different form of technology, and that ultimately carried its way into the U.S. reactor fleet. They also have a variety of sizes, microreactors, which are 10 megawatts or less. What I would say are smaller scale reactors that are less than 300 megawatts, and then the larger reactors that are 300 megawatts or more. And you described this a little bit. The reactors we currently have here in the U.S., most of those are in excess of 1,000 megawatts. Now, when we go into these designs, the first grouping of these are the light water reactor category. And I'm going to talk today about some of them, not all of them. There are over 30 different designs that are out there right now. But I'm going to talk about some of the representative technologies that have gotten a bit more of the attention. The first one is the NuScale reactor. This is a light water reactor, about 77 megawatts. A series of these modules would be in a large pool. That is a design that is promoted by NuScale, a company based out of Oregon. They've received about $1.5 billion in funding, and they will be demonstrating their first 6-module reactor at Idaho National Laboratory with Utah Municipal Associated Power District. The second one I would mention would be the GE Hitachi BWRX 300. GE is a company that obviously has produced a lot of the reactors around the world, 1/3 of the current US fleet. They have a 300 megawatt design that is actually in an underground configuration. And that design was selected by Ontario Power Generation, which is Canada's largest energy producer, for deployment at an existing Canadian nuclear site called Darlington. Similarly, Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a quasi-governmental entity, recently selected that design for deployment at their site. There were 2 companies that received awards from the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and this is a $3+ billion program from the Department of Energy. You mentioned one of them, TerraPower. Their reactor, as you mentioned, will be deployed in Wyoming. That's interesting for 2 aspects. One, it is at a former coal site, so it does demonstrate the ability to reutilize those power lines, the switch yards, the other equipment at the site. It's also noteworthy in that it operates nominally at about 345 megawatts, but it's paired with a molten salt storage facility. They use what's called solar salt, similar to some of the thermal solar facilities out west. And that can operate at about 500 to 550 megawatts for about a 5.5 hour period of time. And that allows them to meet more of the requirements, the peaking requirements in places like California and elsewhere. The second recipient of that program was the X-Energy XC100. This is a company that is based in Rockville, Maryland. They use a high temperature gas reactor that uses something called triso fuel. This is a multi-coated fuel. It's made up into fuel assemblies about the size of a cue ball. And inside the vessel of that design, they have about 300 of these assemblies, and that's where the high pressure helium goes through and is heated. Those are about 80 megawatts that has been, as I mentioned, selected for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and they'll be deploying that design at an existing site in Washington State. Rounding it out, there's a couple of molten salt reactors, Terrestrial Energy, which has a 195 megawatt design. They're working with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and its fellow agency in Canada, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, to demonstrate and license their design. Kairos, which is based in Oakland, California, they have a 140 megawatt design that uses a pebble bed reactor, but they use a molten salt coolant, so that's somewhat different. They did receive a large DOE award, about $30 million for their design. And then finally, Peter, you mentioned microreactors. There's a couple of designs out there right now. Oklo has their Aurora reactor. That's about 1.5 megawatts. They have a proposal to deploy that reactor also in Idaho. And they are back and forth with the NRC on their licensing process. And finally, Westinghouse, a well-known name in nuclear technologies. Their design goes up to about 5 megawatts, and that uses what's called a solid core heat pipe to produce that energy. So a lot of different designs, a lot of different technologies, and innovative and advanced, but with long-held roots in the U.S. nuclear industry and with the Department of Energy and its predecessor, the Atomic Energy Commission.
Well, thank you for that explanation. I think one thing that I'd like to add to it is that people may not be aware of this, but we have a system of national labs in this country, and the national labs have really taken a major role in being able to test these reactors. Obviously, the idea is that they become put into use, and I think a lot of trust gets built when the developers are submitting their plans and they're being tested in the national labs, so that people can see and put some credence into the results that come out of the tests. Would you agree with that?
I do, Peter. The leading lab in the U.S. is Idaho National Labs in these advanced reactors, obviously located in Idaho, but others that are quite involved. Oak Ridge in Tennessee has a number of advanced reactor programs, Argonne out of Chicago, and others. So we've got a great network of national laboratories. They have been very well funded to promote these technologies. But I would say from a North American perspective, their sister entity, the Canadian National Labs in Chalk River, Ontario, which is northwest of Toronto, is similarly involved on behalf of Canada, which has made also a significant investment in these kind of reactor technologies.
Great. Okay, well, I would like to now move over to the legislative side because there have been 3 pieces of legislation that have been recently passed pertaining to the advanced reactors, namely the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act in 2017, the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act in 2019, and the Energy Act of 2020. Could you please explain to us what these acts do and how they impact the advanced reactor community?
Well, there's a lot there, and I will touch on those. I will also say, I think it's important to note Congress, and I would say 2 respects here. Congress has been, it's been quite amazing. When I first came to Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s, there were a lot of folks up in Congress who didn't like nuclear power, who were coming off of some plants that had some problems getting built. The amount of support in Congress these days for advanced nuclear is really palpable. These bills that are coming out, the ones that you mentioned, have been passing with 2/3 to 3/4 of the members of Congress supporting them. So I think it's important as a leading element to really explain to folks things have really changed in the support of these technologies. And in addition, from a funding standpoint, the office in DOE that's responsible for a lot of these nuclear programs is the Office of Nuclear Energy. And there was a point 10 years ago, their funding was down to a very, very small amount of money. But year over year, whether it's the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now President Biden, that budget has been increasing at a clip of at or above 10% per year. And currently their funding is running about $1.8 billion, $1.9 billion. So those are real dollars. That's very impactful on what we're trying to accomplish. The pieces that you mentioned, I'm going to sort of do a highlight of each. The Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act was really responsible for laying the groundwork for providing some of the incentives that we've talked about, where you have public-private partnerships, folks like Bill Gates, folks like X-Energy, that can tee up money, have that matched by literally billions of US dollars, and allow these technologies to be taken from research into the field and really put on the grid in a meaningful way. Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, that was important because it sent out some signals that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission really needed to change its way of doing business. It needed to come up, and the language called for the agency to create a framework which would allow these designs to be regulated in an innovative way, recognize that they're safer, and try to have a regulatory framework that was more streamlined and supportive of these moving forward. Finally, the Energy Act of 2020, I think probably one of the more important elements to that is really related to the fuel. Many of the reactor designs of which I've spoken about today, particularly some of the high temperature gas reactors and molten salt reactors, many of them use a different enrichment of fuel than is currently in the fleet today. Typically, you go to a nuclear power plant in the US, they enrich that fuel to just about 5%. But for the purposes of some of these designs, we'll be using enrichment levels that get us a lot closer to 19.75%. Why? Well, it makes them more efficient, it makes them more cost effective. The challenge is we don't have that capability in the US right now to manufacture that fuel. The Energy Act of 2020 was really put into place a program to direct the Department of Energy to create a program that would make that fuel available, whether it's for the civilian reactors or also having that available for some of the non-Navy military reactors that are being proposed. So an important element and really sort of the final element in making a lot of this work. So to that extent, excellent support of Congress, excellent support when it comes to money, excellent support when it comes to authorizations, and certainly sending strong signals to the market and certainly to the nuclear regulator that we need to get moving on these technologies.
Well, before we leave the subject, I think that it's important to understand that some of this funding has gone into a company in Ohio, which is now producing the centrifuges so that this fuel known as HALEU, stands for high assay low enrichment uranium, can be done and produced in the US, because currently the US is reliant on other sources. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's the company you're talking about is Centrus, and Dan Poneman, who's a former Deputy Secretary of DOE under President Biden, is the CEO of that company. They are working with the US government and DOE to create a facility in Portsmouth, Ohio, that would be able to produce material at that level. One of the challenges, and I think this is a timely one, is the best source today for fuel of that enrichment level is frankly Russia, which does have that capability and does tap into many of the former weapons that they had for providing down blended fuel for that market. I think the conflict in Ukraine has clearly brought everyone to the recognition we can't put ourselves at risk and have others provide that. And so Centrus, there are others in the market, Urenco, which is a European-based company. They have a facility in New Mexico that could potentially be modified to provide that fuel. Orno, which is a French-based company. So there are other sources of these services. It really is going to need some assistance on the part of the U.S. government to try to help drive some of that market and bring it together. But given the actions, I think that will certainly help with the market signals in moving these forward.
Right. So you were mentioning that a lot of this is being directed to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to come up with regulations for the advanced reactors. But before we get into that, I think it's important for people to understand the different domains of the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because when I was an NRC commissioner, a lot of people sort of got confused about who we were and what we responded to. You sort of have to look a little bit back at history. In the early days of atomic energy, the Atomic Energy Commission was responsible for both the regulation of nuclear energy as well as its promotion. There was a bit of a conflict of interest in that, and by 1975, under President Nixon, they really recognized that they need to split that body up so that you had the regulator on one side of the lane and you had the promoter on the other side. And ultimately, there were a couple of name changes here, but ultimately that what came out of that was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is an independent regulator. It is not part of the Department of Energy. It is not directly reporting to either the president or Congress, but it's made up of 5 individuals, men and women, Republicans and Democrats. You can't have more than 3 of either party. And they're responsible for regulating all the civilian uses of radioactive and nuclear material in the United States. But obviously, their biggest role is regulating the power plants and the fuel that supplies them. The Department of Energy is really our nation's science lab, and I think it's 14 plus laboratories that it houses really is the driver of science for a whole variety of different applications that we really take for granted in the country. But in the case of nuclear energy, as mentioned, Idaho National Labs, Oak Ridge, Savannah River, Argonne, those are some of the more key elements of that national laboratory system, which has been incredibly enabling of really creating and researching a lot of these technologies that can be taken out of the labs and applied in a real world way for civilian needs.
Right, and I think also the Pacific Northwest Labs and Sandy have a role in this as well at times.
Yes.
Before we go into addressing the advanced reactor rulemaking, people now are functioning under what's called Part 50 and Part 52. It's 10 CFR, Part 50 and 52. And that's the way that the light water reactors got licensed. But I understand that because these other regulations are still being proposed and haven't been adopted, that some of the developers are using Part 50 and especially Part 52 and are trying to get their approvals that way. Is that correct?
Yeah, and let me put a little bit of that into context for folks who aren't as close to it as you and I are. So Part 50 was the original framework that was actually dates back to the Atomic Energy Commission, and that was really used to license virtually all of the reactors that we have that are operating today. It was a framework that essentially a utility would go into the NRC. They would have a construction license. They would go through a hearing process and be granted that construction process. They would then go and build that reactor. Once that was near completion, they would go in for a second license, the operating license. And then once granted and once they got through a second hearing process, then they go ahead and operate the plant. That became a bit contentious in the late 80s and early 90s when you had some nuclear power plants that had some real challenges from outside interveners who were effectively trying to use that process to stop those reactors. A few of them went into bankruptcy. We had Shoreham up in Long Island, ultimately, while it did go through that process, ultimately never operated at full power. So that process had a lot of challenges to it. When I was a commissioner in the late 90s, early 2000s, we created Part 52. And the intention of that effort was to say, well, if you use a pre-existing permit for the site, early site permit, and if you have the reactor design pre-licensed, then as a utility, you could come to the NRC if you had a site identified, you could apply for a combined operating and construction license, utilizing an approved design, and you would go through one set of hearings and go ahead and build your reactor. Now that's the process that they've used down at the Vogtle site. It's Vogtle units 3 and 4, which are being built by Georgia Power, which is part of Southern Company. The first of those reactors will come online late 2022 or first quarter of 23, and the second one, or unit 4, fairly quickly behind that. Now what's the last piece of that Part 52 is, and the real benefit to it is, with the combined operating license, you can actually recognize you're going to be able to operate it before you start spending the very large amount of money to actually build the reactor. All you really got to do is pass a series of tests that validate that, in fact, you built the reactor according to the license and the way it should be built. Now, the designs that we've spoken about earlier today, virtually all of them you've described, Peter, are going to use either Part 50 or Part 52 for their designs. And what that really means is those two frameworks, 50 and 52, which were established for light water reactors, can be used, but they will have to, the applicants will have to seek a series of exemptions for those elements that don't really apply to non-light water reactors. But having said that, that process can be made to work. Now, as we mentioned, Congress, through NEIMA, wanted the NRC to put together an effort for Part 53. The intention there was to try to create a dedicated advanced reactor framework for those designs under Part 53 to make it streamlined in such a way to sort of reduce some of those burdens in Part 50 and 52, and to try to do it promptly. Now, originally, it was intended that they would do it by 2027. Congress then sent some signals that they wanted it sooner than that. And now the NRC is under a process of engagement where they're shooting to have that new process put into place by 2025. But that said, in the meantime, the existing two rules, 50 and 52, are really going to be the framework for most of these designs moving forward, at least initially.
Right. So NEIMA was supposed to, the 2019 Act was supposed to bring Part 53 into fruition, and 2020 Energy Act was supposed to speed it up. But the development of Part 53 seems to be organically a collaborative process right now amongst the NRC and certain NGOs and the industry. Do you think this is working out?
Well, I would say the jury's still out on that, Peter. And I wouldn't. The only thing having heard you ask the question, I'm not certain the NRC would say it's a collaborative process. It's an open process, and they are doing something different than they normally do with rulemaking. Typically, in a rulemaking process, the agency comes up with what it believes is a proposed rule. You put that out into the arena. People make public comments. The agency goes back. There's a final rule, and ultimately you go through that process to get to a final decision point. In this particular case, and this dates back almost 2 years ago at this point, the NRC started bringing out pieces and basically subsections of the rule, and said, okay, this is something we're thinking about doing relative to the use of risk in the rule, use of certain health objectives. And they started putting these various pieces out. The industry, whether it was the Nuclear Industry Council that I chair their Advanced Reactor Task Force, or the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is a large utility-led association, other stakeholders, anti-nuclear stakeholders, we got a chance to comment on a variety of those subtitles as they came out. I think that didn't probably go as according to plan as a lot of folks hoped. I think there was a lot of concern on the part of the advanced reactor community and the utilities that what the agency was coming up with was going to really meet some of the goals that Congress had set out for it. And so, there was a delay. Originally, the agency was going to try to have that rule together by 2024. They did take a pause of about 9 months in that process, and they are at this point re-engaging with the industry to try to see if we can bridge some of those differences. I would say we're not there yet.
So it said that this new Part 53 is to be based on, quote, technology-inclusive, risk-informed framework. What does that really mean?
Well, one of the things, I think a tool that is greatly advanced from where it used to be is something called a probabilistic risk assessment. And that's where you basically take a lot of the particular actions down there. You analyze what some of those consequences are going to be, and then you come up with a risk analysis that you apply to the particular design to determine what's the level of requirements you need to have for that design. And so a technology-inclusive risk-informed framework was supposed to be able to be flexible and use and be technology neutral, so you could apply it to a variety of different reactors, and then put in this probabilistic risk-informed based framework to assess what are the particular features or what are the particular requirements you need to have for that individual design. Now, there has been, I will say there's been a lot of progress on that piece of the Part 53 effort. I think the NRC staff has embraced more of those risk rules. One of the challenges that came up and one of the reasons for the delay in the process was that the agency had focused on a singular form of that had come up, and other advanced reactor developers said, this is a bit more complicated and expansive than we think is appropriate for the simplicity of the design that we've identified. We'd like to have the opportunity to have other alternative means of using risk, but not in such a complicated way and so broad. So the agency is in the midst right now of really engaging with the stakeholder community with some options on trying to meet that particular desire and expectation to have multiple approaches for the use of risk in developing these regulations.
If you take a look at the draft of the Part 53 regs, it's over 400 pages long. What actually is being included besides what we just discussed?
Well, and therein lies, I think, some of the differences of opinion. There's a basic philosophical difference between the staff at the NRC and the external, for the most part, most of the external stakeholder community about that. Now, I'll use something like, there's a term that we use called a LARA, as low as reasonably achievable. And that is a philosophy of trying to ensure that the plants meet certain objectives. That ALARA requirement is included in Part 20. And that is, it's well understood. It went through a separate rulemaking process. Utilities, designers understand Part 20. The NRC staff has the idea, well, everything that applies to advanced reactors should be in one rule. And the advanced reactor developers and the utilities, for the most part, are saying, no, ALARA is just fine. You don't have to take ALARA and replicate it and make Part 50 bigger. Principally because if you have a freestanding requirement in Part 20 that applies to all of the other reactors out there and all the other activities the NRC regulates, and then you've got a replicate of it within the context of Part 53, if you make minor changes either to Part 20 or Part 53, you got to be very careful about making sure that there's not a difference between those two. And basically what we've been telling the agencies, that doesn't make any sense. You've already got Part 20 as a rule. Keep it where it is. Take it out of Part 53. Just do a cross-reference. We're lawyers after all. We know how to do cross-references and deal with it that way. So that's one of the reasons. And there's a variety of other elements of the rule that are like that. We just don't think that makes a lot of sense. Now, another one is something called quantitative health objectives. And these are certain numerical and other standards that relate to how one regulates these plants relative to the health impacts that will happen. Well, in the case of QHOs, there is pre-existing guidance the agency has issued that applies to that. It can be referenced in the rule. The staff is against saying, well, we don't want to reference that guidance. We want to pull all that language into the rule. That creates a whole series of difficulties in that process. We think it's duplicative. And in fact, the totality of some of these things that the NRC staff is trying to accomplish, we believe, is actually increasing the amount of regulatory requirements on light water on these advanced reactors that currently don't apply to the existing fleet. And we think that is counter to what the intent was in Congress in these various pieces of legislation we talked about earlier to incentivize and really enable these technologies to be deployed given their safer track record. So it is a complicated issue. I think the agency staff, albeit well-meaning, has really made the framework of a rule which is too complicated and is not really meeting what we believe is expectations of Congress.
I noticed that that you've been working on behalf of USNIC, which is Nuclear Industry Council, and a few months ago, in conjunction with NEI, Nuclear Energy Institute, you co-authored a letter to the NRC. What were you trying to accomplish? Is it the type of thing that you just discussed with us, or are there additional items that were brought up?
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and that was somewhat of a seminal letter. It was over 100 pages, and it was done in a very collaborative process between USNIC and NEI. But as a former NRC commissioner, we try to give it the best attempt we could to engage with the NRC staff to try to resolve some of these issues. And I think that letter, we were having these meetings, monthly, bi-monthly meetings for almost 2 years. And we weren't making the kind of progress that we thought needed to be made. And frankly, in a number of areas where we had come up with some very innovative alternatives to some of the things that the NRC staff was proposing, there were times where we really felt we weren't being heard as stakeholders. And so we took the normal process. We started with the NRC staff. We had engagement with senior managers on these issues. Again, some of these issues were addressed, some weren't. But we really felt that the commissioners, who are ultimately responsible for establishing the policy of the NRC and who ultimately are going to be reviewing and evaluating what the staff comes up with, we felt they really need to understand in detail the significant concerns we had in the direction that the staff was going. And that led in part to the decision on the part of the agency to delay this whole process by 9 months.
It's interesting because I think that the one thing that everybody can agree on is that we have to assure that there's public safety and that these reactors are safe. But having said that, do you think the NRC could be moving faster to get these regs out more quickly?
Well, I think the issue is this: that when you follow the NRC, there's sort of certain mantra words, and one of those mantra words is really the agency's function is to assure the adequate protection of public health and safety in the use of these technologies. The Atomic Energy Act also has within it the notion that the agency is to enable the safe use of nuclear technologies, and so there's no quantitative statement that the agency is going to make a judgment call. If they can be determined to meet that adequate protection standard, then they should be licensed. To me, it's not as much a function of being built for speed. It's being built for a function of getting a rule that's going to be as I put it, used and useful. Now, they could very quickly come up with a rule that no one's going to use. And as described previously, we have alternate opportunities and avenues and approaches to take in parts 50 and 52. So, these designs are going to move forward. These designs are going to be built, and that's going to happen irrespective of whether we have part 50. I just think the agency could be doing better. I think they need to do it promptly, but I think we need to get to a point where we have a rule that will be used by the advanced reactor community and utilities and useful in making sure that these reactors, which have massive funding by the U.S. Congress, will able to be deployed.
Yeah, I'm wondering, when Part 53 finally is promulgated, do you think that that a lot of these developers are going to take their Part 52 applications and try to put them in Part 53 so that because it's more suitable to non-light water reactor technologies?
I think the jury's really out on that one. If you go through the Part 52 process, that does require the certification of the design. And so if you've already got a certified design, it may well be, if you've already done that process once, it may just be easier to replicate future ones through Part 52. I don't know. Really, at the end of the day, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and it's just not clear whether we're going to end up with a Part 53 that's going to meet that deliciousness test.
Right. When I look at this, and I've seen some of the materials that have been put out by the NRC, and at times it gets to be kind of confusing. I was looking at a slide from a presentation done by the NRC recently, and what they said was that they're trying to incorporate four different elements. One element was the language in parts 50 and 52. Another one was the Part 53 framework innovation. The third one was compatibility with international standards. And the fourth one was to develop unique rule language, which I believe is based on the experience that they've had with Part 52. And it seems to me that it's kind of difficult to try to reconcile all these different elements into one part. And on top of it, you don't want it to end up that there are so many material differences in language and standards between existing regulations such as 50 and 52 and the new regulations in Part 53. And I'm having difficulty in trying to see how they're going to reconcile these different elements.
Well,
can you comment on that?
Yeah, you raise a really good point. I mean, there is a certain degree, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way. I do think there's a little bit of cherry picking going on the part of the NRC staff of elements that they perhaps had, and I say this as a former commissioner, that they've been trying to get into rule language dating back several decades ago. That they haven't had a chance to do. I think genuinely there is an interest in trying to come together with some of the international standards. I think there will need to be some unique rule language given the nature of these designs. But I do think simplification is their friend, not complication. That's why, to the point we made before about the length of the rule, of the potential rule, that could be quite problematic. I mean, as my dearly departed mother used to say, if you select too many things, sometimes a stew just doesn't come out the right way. And I think this is a classic example where they may be trying to do too much in the context of this rule, but we'll see.
Yeah. Another thing I found interesting was that there was a letter written by, I guess it's the Republicans on the Committee for Science, Space, and Technology. And I'm just going to pull out a couple of the quotes and let you comment on that, because what it seems is that they're kind of frustrated with the speed at which this is progressing. The two quotes are the following. One, current licensing process produces poses unique challenges for the development and deployment of advanced nuclear reactors. And then they go on later to say, we strongly encourage the NRC to increase their level of communication with DOE and the committee to improve and modernize their approach. To me, they're sort of saying, get on with it, guys. Is that how you read it?
Well, yeah, I think it is. Now, I want to say, as a former commissioner, I know the three current members of the commission: Chairman Hansen, David Wright, and Commissioner Barron, and they are all solid people. I think they want to do the right thing. They've all said that they believe that we need to have a Part 53 process that makes sense. I think the NRC staff is earnest in trying to do the best they can, but I think in some regards the process they have so far has gone a bit long, and I think they would be better served by really trying to streamline it, try to come up with something that does meet that adequate protection standard, but does not put additional impediments that frankly don't apply to the current fleet of reactors on what are innovative and exciting and very safe new technologies. Now, I would say, there is one thing we talked a little bit about, and I would want to mention before we come to a close. I mean, there is action is going to need to be undertaken by Congress relative to the provision of high assay, low enriched uranium. We talked about it a little bit. There are both monetary and other incentives that have been put out by Congress. I think it really is incumbent on the Department of Energy to move out on some of that. And we really do need the U.S. government to take a leadership position to make sure that, to the extent that we have funded at billions of dollars innovative nuclear technologies, we need to make sure we've got the fuel that can power those technologies. And I think likewise, there's a real opportunity. Canada, which is going to be using the same technologies, has no ability to enrich. And so having and really enabling US and Canada to work together on this, I think, is going to be important. And I just want to put that out there before we come to a close.
Well, before we come to a close, I would like to put out one other point, and that is that I think that this is moving forward on a successful basis because it is a public-private partnership, and that model is a very important one. But private investors need assurance that they're going to get approvals if they're following a set of rules that are put out there relatively quickly. And they also need a reliable time frame, because they don't want to put money into some type of a venture and not have an idea when it's going to come out. They have to be able to have a predictable outcome. And I think this is one of the reasons that it's so important to have this promulgation of Part 53 as soon as possible, obviously consistent with public health and safety. Because at the end of the day, I just want to finish, at the end of the day, these Generation 4 reactors are really vitally important to the US. They're important because of the defense capability that the US needs. And also, by the way, the flip side of that is the non-proliferation. And the US standards are very important. If we're not able to get our technology out there and our technology adopted and the rules that go with that adopted, there are non-proliferation issues there. The third thing that I think is very important is the economic self-sufficiency. You alluded to the fact that Russia is a producer of nuclear fuel, and we now see all the problems and potentially grave problems that could occur if we are not economically self-sufficient. And the other thing is that if you don't want to confront this political aspect of it, the climate change is something that's going to be absolutely vital in the next coming decades. And we're going to need more clean energy, and we're going to need more electricity from clean sources. And nuclear is the one that's going to really address being a key element in addressing not only the climate change and the increase in the electricity that people are trying to implement, but also the huge amount of energy that's going to be needed if people are going to successfully move from the 80% fossil fuels that are presently being consumed. So I think Part 53 promulgation is a very important issue.
Yeah, Peter, let me just finish on a couple of points that play off of what you just said. The first one is you mentioned, China and Russia. Russia right now is a major export of nuclear technologies. Countries like Egypt, Bangladesh, India, China, Belarus, Turkey, all currently in the process of either building or have built Russian reactors.
Egypt
as well. Thank you. We don't have that same level of export product. Now, there are, Westinghouse was poised to sell their reactors to Ukraine. Hopefully that goes through. There are other U.S. technologies that are being deployed potentially in Europe. But these advanced reactor technologies that we talked about today really provide an opportunity for the U.S. to regain that level of market-leading expertise, know-how, and exports that we really had starting from Dwight David Eisenhower days, President Eisenhower days, of which you spoke earlier, all the way up through really the early 2000s. So that's going to make a real difference, and I think it's vitally important. To that point, 2 years ago, I was in Kenya. I could have sold half a dozen of these reactors in a meeting of 17 countries that are looking at them. So I think there's some real potential. Second, I advise, and many other things I do, a number of U.S. utility executives and CEOs. They're grappling with the fact they want to completely decarbonize, and they want to meet these targets because they recognize we've got a climate issue. We've got to deal with carbon. They can get 8% of the way there, and what they'll tell you is, they're investing in renewables, they're investing in wind, solar, and batteries, but they can't get there with those technologies. There is really that 20% gap where they need reliable, baseload-like or non-intermittent technologies that can meet that 24/7 power output, and frankly, renewables and batteries just won't get us there. Finally, I do want to put a little bit of a note on this. I think everyone wants to embrace a Part 53 that is used and useful, one that enables these reactors to be deployed in a way that meets the adequate protection standard for public health and the environment, and really balances out that economic efficiency with protecting public health and safety. That said, the existing Part 50 and 52 processes we're going to make them work in the intervening time period, and these technologies are going to continue to move forward irrespective of how Part 53 ends out. So I'm very, I meet with these developers all the time. I'm incredibly excited about how far we've come in the last 7 years, and I think we're going to begin to see these facilities deployed in the late 2020s, and they will be a major change in the way we produce electricity, and one that's going to be beneficial for the economy, beneficial for the environment, and beneficial for exports.
Well, I thank you for that. I just want to underline one aspect that you sort of glided over, and that is the reliability aspect. Nuclear by far is the most reliable energy source, and it is easy to envision how nuclear will be an interplay with renewables in order to provide a steady stream of electrons, which is what is desired and needed by both business and private individuals. So I want to thank you so much for coming on, and I hope that the audience appreciated why these proposed NRC regulations for advanced nuclear reactors are so important. And hopefully we can come back and celebrate the success when it's finally promulgated. So thanks so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Peter.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.